Many people experience drowsiness and fatigue after eating, assuming it is a normal part of the process. Unfortunately, drowsiness after eating is not a normal response from the body, and it should not be ignored. So in this video, I will cover several topics related to this issue. I will discuss whether the drowsiness that appears after eating is a cause for concern, what causes it, and how can it be prevented. One of the main causes of fatigue and drowsiness after a meal is a reactive hypoglycemia, otherwise known as postprandial hypoglycemia. For those who are unaware, hypoglycemia is a phenomenon in which there is a significant decrease in blood sugar. Usually, it is referred to as a concentration below 70 mg per deciliter. However, too low a level of glucose in the blood is usually associated with fasting when we don't supply food. So why does it happen that when we eat a meal, the sugar level instead of rising falls below a safe normal? We can explain the causes of this situation in several ways. Firstly, it can occur in people who have had stomach or small intestine resection. In these patients, delayed and increased insulin secretion, meaning a hormone whose task is to lower blood glucose level after a meal, may occur. Under normal circumstances, this is a desirable effect. However, as I mentioned, if too much insulin is released into the bloodstream, then the sugar level drops too abruptly. Similarly, this effect can sometimes be seen in people with stomach ulcers. Postprandial reactive hypoglycemia may also occur in individuals with renal glucosuria, a situation where glucose passes from the blood to the urine and as a result escapes from the body. Under normal circumstances, when the kidneys are healthy, they effectively filter the blood and reabsorb the glucose they find back into the circulation. When the kidneys' work is impaired, they are not able to capture glucose, and therefore, as I mentioned, the sugar is excreted from the body. There are several causes that may lead to kidney damage and renal glucosuria. These include heavy metal poisoning such as cadmium, mercury, and lead. Other causes are the presence of various diseases including nephrotic syndrome and intestinal nephritis. Renal glucosuria may also be caused by kidney transplantation. Furthermore, depending on the cause, feelings of drowsiness and fatigue may appear from half an hour to 3 hours after eating. It is also worth mentioning that in addition to drowsiness and fatigue, a number of other symptoms may occur. These symptoms include anxiety and nervousness, trembling of the hands, excessive sweating, pallor of the skin, and even increased blood pressure. These symptoms occur due to a significant drop in the level of glucose in the blood, leading to the release of catecholamines such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. The lack of glucose in the blood also results in a lack of fuel for the brain. This in turn can lead to visual disturbances, difficulty concentrating, and memory problems. It must also be acknowledged that it can be difficult to identify the direct cause of reactive hypoglycemia in some people. For some unknown reason, they may be producing too little of the hormone glucagon, which is responsible for increasing blood glucose levels. Another explanation for hypoglycemia could be that for unknown reasons, the cells of the body become overly sensitive to the effects of insulin. This is the opposite of insulin resistance. Excessive sensitivity to insulin means that even in the presence of small amounts of the hormone, cells rapidly and excessively absorb glucose from the bloodstream. Scientists have observed that reactive hypoglycemia is relatively common among people with chronic stress, overworked people, and those characterized by excessive emotionality and anxiety states. If you feel sleepy after meals and have a glucometer at home, I recommend checking your blood sugar level when you feel drowsy. Additionally, the symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia usually appear after consuming meals high in simple sugars and carbohydrates that are easily absorbed, such as sweets, juices, soft drinks, fruits, jams, and products based on white wheat flour. Given all this information, I have some tips that can be helpful for people struggling with reactive hypoglycemia. Firstly, it is important to ensure that the meals consumed have a low or moderate glycemic index. This means that the products included in the dishes do not cause a sudden spike in blood sugar levels, as this leads to a significant decrease in glucose levels below the norm. In short, it is better for the sugar level to rise and fall gradually rather than suddenly. To ensure a low glycemic index of dishes, we should limit the consumption of products that are a source of easily digestible carbohydrates, including those mentioned previously. On the other hand, if we decide to choose products rich in carbohydrates, we should try to choose sources of complex carbohydrates such as whole wheat pasta, buckwheat, or barley groats, and replace white rice with brown rice. It is also a good practice to add a source of complete protein, fat, and dietary fiber to each meal. This means eating meat, fish, seafood, unrefined plant oils, nuts, flaxseed, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, and sunflower seeds. For those dealing with postprandial hypoglycemia, maintaining regular meal times can be helpful. That is around 4 meals a day, eating relatively smaller portions at a time. For those who do not suffer from postprandial hypoglycemia, there is no need to eat a large number of meals a day. A healthy diet can consist of 3 or even 2 meals depending on one's lifestyle and macronutrient distribution. For example, people on a high-fat diet usually do well with 2 meals per day. I would like to proceed to the second cause of sleepiness and fatigue after eating, which is consuming too large portions of meals. When we reach for food, large amounts of blood are transported to the digestive tract. This is a normal physiological reflex. It helps to improve digestion as well as increase the absorption and transport of nutrients to individual cells. However, if blood is diverted to one location, it must be taken from another, and it can be simplified that this is at the expense of supplying the brain with blood. There is a hypothesis that the draining of blood from the brain makes us feel less stimulated and more sleepy. This hypothesis has been confirmed in one of the scientific studies. Experts noticed that consuming large meals in volume contributed to greater sleepiness among the drivers. So, as I mentioned before, if we struggle with sleepiness after eating, it is worth checking if reducing the size of meals can be a helpful solution for us, regardless of whether we struggle with reactive hypoglycemia or not. In preparing for today's material, I also came across a study in which scientists observed interesting correlations. They noticed that people who ate meals with high fat content experienced increased drowsiness. In this experiment, predictably, the authors of this survey recorded an increase in cholecystokinin levels, a hormone from the intestines that helps with the digestion of fat. It logically follows that as we consume more fat, more of these substances that aid in its digestion are produced. It is this hormone, cholecystokinin, that is associated with the feeling of drowsiness. Experts suggest that this hormone can inhibit the release of noradrenaline, thus causing fatigue and drowsiness. Therefore, it is advisable for people who experience drowsiness after meals to compose their meal with a variety of components, not just fat, but also protein and complex carbohydrates. I would suggest checking how the body reacts to reducing the amount of fat in the meal in favor of increasing the amount of complete protein. Current understanding shows that protein does not significantly raise the blood glucose level and, on the other hand, provides amino acids for producing glucose if it is deficient. Therefore, protein is helpful in stabilizing the blood sugar levels. Sometimes caffeine, for example in the form of morning coffee, can be responsible for feeling sleepy after a meal. As we know, caffeine has a stimulating effect. I will briefly explain why this occurs. Normally, circulating particles in the body called neurotransmitters connect with different regions of the body, known as receptors. If such a particle connects to a receptor, this results in a certain effect. For example, if a neurotransmitter called adenosine connects to receptors that recognize it, this causes a feeling of sleepiness. What does this have to do with coffee? Well, the caffeine contained in coffee has a similar structure to the aforementioned adenosine and occupies its receptors. Therefore, adenosine is unable to function properly, and instead of feeling sleepy, we feel stimulated. It may happen that when caffeine is eventually broken down, it can free up places in the receptors where adenosine can bind more strongly. This can lead to decreased energy and drowsiness after drinking coffee. Additionally, researchers suggest that due to caffeine consumption, the body's compensatory mechanism is triggered, increasing sensitivity to adenosine. This neurotransmitter is thus more effective, therefore drinking coffee with meals can cause drowsiness. For people struggling with drowsiness after having a meal, I suggest avoiding coffee and observing how their body reacts to this change. Current knowledge suggests that the cause of the feeling of exhaustion after a meal for people with celiac disease could be non-adherence to a gluten-free diet. Researchers have observed that the consumption of gluten-containing products by these people has caused various ailments, including fatigue, abdominal pain, diarrhea, headaches, and increased irritability. However, it is still not fully understood why this happens. If you suffer from celiac disease and experience fatigue, especially after meals, it is worth starting to adhere to the principles of a gluten-free diet. Perhaps eliminating all sources of gluten from your diet will help prevent you from feeling drowsy and exhausted. When discussing the elimination of certain foods, it is important to mention food allergies. There are indications that suggest that consuming allergens by people who are allergic to them may cause hypoglycemia after meals, although the mechanism of this phenomenon is not yet fully understood. This is something to keep in mind if you have a food allergy. As you can see, there are a number of causes that can lead to drowsiness after eating a meal. In many cases, this is a typical reaction of the body due to a certain physiological conditions. Therefore, feeling sleepy after eating should not be a cause for concern. However, if it turns out that the culprit of the whole situation is a low level of glucose in the blood, then it is worth introducing some tips that will help regulate its concentration and dispel the annoying ailments associated with reactive hypoglycemia. I also encourage you to watch my other videos on the channel. Here I especially recommend the video about how you can reverse diabetes, which still remains on the topic of problems with carbohydrate metabolism. And that's all from me for today. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.